This is the story of the oldest temple ever built by human hands, a place so ancient it should not exist. It was raised in the hills of southern Turkey around 11,600 years ago. That makes it older than the pyramids, older than Stonehenge, older than writing, older than the wheel, older even than farming itself. It was built by people we were taught could not build anything at all. Simple hunter-gatherers with no metal, no pottery, no cities. And when they were finished with it, they did something even stranger. They buried the entire thing on purpose and vanished. For 12,000 years it lay hidden beneath a lonely hill, while every history book told a story that turned out to be wrong. This is Göbekli Tepe, the ancient temple that rewrote the story of civilization itself. Chapter 1. The Hill They Almost Ignored. Our story begins with one of the greatest missed discoveries in the history of archaeology. In 1963, a joint team of researchers from the University of Chicago and Istanbul University was surveying the arid hills of southeastern Turkey, near the city of Şanlıurfa. They came to a rounded rise in the landscape the locals called Göbekli Tepe, which means roughly, Potbelly Hill. On its slopes, they noticed broken pieces of limestone and some worked stone poking through the soil, and they wrote it off. They assumed the slabs were grave markers, the remains of an abandoned medieval cemetery. There seemed no reason to dig deeper into an ordinary hill scattered with what looked like old headstones. So they noted it, moved on, and the greatest archaeological site of the 20th century went back to sleep for another 30 years. Then in 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt came looking. Schmidt had been working at other Neolithic sites in the region, and when he read the old survey notes describing broken limestone slabs on a hilltop, something didn't add up. Medieval gravestones don't usually come in massive worked slabs. So he drove out to Potbelly Hill to see it for himself. Schmidt later said that within minutes of walking the surface, he understood two things. The first was that this was not medieval. The second was that this was going to consume the rest of his life. He was right about both. Scattered across that hill were the tips of enormous carved stones, and the flint tools and debris around them were not from the Middle Ages. They were from the Stone Age. When Schmidt's team began to excavate, the hill started to give up its secret. Just beneath the surface stood great T-shaped pillars of limestone, arranged in circles, standing exactly where they had been placed thousands of years before. Some rose higher than a man. Their surfaces were carved with animals. And the deeper the team dug, the older and the more astonishing the structures became. This was the moment the story of human history began to crack. Because everything about this place, the scale of it, the artistry of it, the sheer organization it must have taken, belonged to a chapter of the human story that, according to the textbooks, had not been written yet. Schmidt would spend the next 20 years here, until his death in 2014, and in all that time he barely scratched the surface. Ground-penetrating radar revealed that what had been excavated was only a fraction of the whole. Beneath the hill lay many more of these great stone circles, still buried, still waiting. In fact, geophysical surveys, ground-penetrating radar and magnetic scans that let archaeologists see beneath the soil without lifting a single spade, suggest the hill hides something like 15 to 20 of these great enclosures in total. And after 3 decades of digging, only a small fraction of the site has actually been excavated. By some estimates, less than 5%. Everything we are about to describe, every giant pillar, every carved beast, comes from that thin sliver. The overwhelming majority of Göbekli Tepe is still down there, untouched, sleeping beneath the hill. In a very real sense, we are still standing at the very beginning of this discovery. But before we go any further, you need to understand just how old Göbekli Tepe really is. Because the numbers are so extreme they're difficult for the human mind to hold. And once you understand the date, nothing about the ancient world looks the same again. Chapter 2. Older than everything. Let's talk about time. When archaeologists radiocarbon dated the oldest layers of Göbekli Tepe, they arrived at a figure of roughly 9,600 BCE. That is about 11,600 years ago. And to feel the weight of that number, we have to compare it to the monuments we usually think of as ancient. Take the Great Pyramid of Giza. To us it is the very symbol of the deep past. It was built around 4,500 years ago. Göbekli Tepe is older than the Great Pyramid by roughly 7,000 years. 7,000. The distance in time between us and the pyramids is smaller than the distance between the pyramids and Göbekli Tepe. Take Stonehenge, that other great symbol of prehistory. Stonehenge was raised around 5,000 years ago. Göbekli Tepe predates it by some 6,000 years. When the first stone of Stonehenge was set in the ground, Göbekli Tepe was already older to those people than the pyramids are to us. But the comparisons that truly break the mind are not about other monuments. They're about the basic building blocks of civilization itself. Göbekli Tepe is older than writing. It is older than the wheel. It is older than metalworking. It is older than pottery. There were no cities anywhere on Earth. There were no kings, no armies, no money, and as far as we can tell, no farming. To picture the world these builders lived in, wind the planet back to the very end of the last ice age. The great glaciers were only just retreating. The mammoths of the north were dying out. Sea levels were far lower, and Britain was still joined to the European mainland by dry land. And here, in what we now call the Fertile Crescent, the country was nothing like the dusty plateau you would see today. It was a rich mosaic of grassland and open woodland, scattered with wild almond and pistachio, and crossed by vast migrating herds of gazelle. For a hunter-gatherer, this was a land of plenty. These were not desperate people clinging to survival at the edge of starvation. They lived in a generous world. And in that world, with full bellies and time to spare, they turned their eyes not to the plow, but to the heavens. Think about what that means. Everything we associate with the word civilization came later. The people who raised these stones had no written language to plan with, no bronze tools to carve with, no draft animals to haul with, no wheels to move anything. They were, by every definition in the old textbooks, Stone Age hunter-gatherers, people who lived by following herds and gathering wild plants. And that is the collision at the heart of this entire story. Because for 100 years, archaeology told a very clear and very logical tale about how civilization began. First, the story went humans learned to farm. Farming produced surplus food. Surplus food allowed people to settle in one place and grow in number. Settled, well-fed populations then had the time, the resources, and the organization to build villages, then towns, then temples, then everything else. Religion and monuments were the luxuries that came at the end, the flowers that bloomed only after agriculture had planted the seed. Göbekli Tepe takes that neat story and turns it upside down. Here is a monument of staggering ambition and skill, and it was built before the farming that was supposed to make it possible. The temple came first. The question is, how? And an even bigger question hides behind it. Why? To understand how impossible this is, we need to stand among the stones themselves. Chapter 3. The Stone Giants. Imagine walking into Göbekli Tepe as it once stood. You pass into a great circular enclosure, its walls lined with benches of stone. And rising from those walls are the pillars, enormous T-shaped monoliths of limestone, standing in a ring, facing inward. The largest of them tower over 5 meters tall. Each one weighs many tons. Some of the biggest are estimated at 10, 15, even 20 tons of solid rock. And at the center of each enclosure stand 2 of the very largest pillars, facing one another like the guardians of the circle. Now here is the first shock. These are not crude standing stones. They are carved with breathtaking skill. Across their surfaces march a menagerie of wild animals, rendered in relief with confidence and life. There are foxes mid-stride. There are wild boars with bristling backs. There are snakes pouring down the stone in waves. There are scorpions and spiders and long-legged birds, cranes and vultures with outstretched wings. There are the great horned aurochs, the wild cattle of the ancient world. These are not gentle, decorative creatures. Overwhelmingly, they are dangerous ones, predators, stingers, biters, things with fangs and claws and venom. Whatever these images meant, this was not a pretty garden. It was a place charged with power and perhaps with fear. Consider the single most famous stone on the entire hill. A pillar in the enclosure archaeologists call Enclosure D, known today as the Vulture Stone. Carved across its face is a great bird with outstretched wings, apparently balancing a round disc, perhaps the sun upon one wing. Around it crawl a scorpion and other creatures. And beneath the vulture stands a small, headless human figure. To many researchers, this looks like a scene about death itself. Perhaps a burial rite in which the dead were exposed to vultures, their flesh returned to the sky, a practice known from far later cultures across the region. On the same stone are three curious rectangular shapes, like little bags or handbags, a motif that would echo strangely through the art of civilizations thousands of years in the future. We cannot read this stone, but it is plainly not decoration. It is a statement, a story or a scripture, told in symbols whose meaning we have completely lost. And then comes the second, deeper shock. The T-shaped pillars are not just abstract shapes. They are people. Look closely at the central pillars and you see it. Carved down the sides are human arms, bending at the elbow, with long-fingered hands meeting over the front of the stone. There are belts carved around their middles, and hanging from the belts, the suggestion of loincloths or animal skins. The flat top of the T is a head seen from the side. These are stylized human beings or perhaps gods or ancestors, colossal stone figures standing in a silent ring, watching over whatever happened in the center. The detail on these central figures is astonishing. Around their carved waists run belts, rendered with buckles and clasps, and from the belts hang what appear to be the pelts of foxes, like ceremonial garments. These are individuals or deities dressed for something, and they did not appear from nowhere. Years before Göbekli Tepe, at a related site called Navali Quarry not far away, Klaus Schmidt and his colleagues had already found smaller T-shaped pillars carrying the same human features, arms, hands, a sense of a body. When that site was drowned beneath the reservoir of a modern dam, its secret seemed lost forever, until Göbekli Tepe revealed the very same idea, far older and on a colossal scale. The T-shaped being was no accident. It was the central image of an entire vanished religion. Stand back and take in the whole picture. This required people to quarry blocks of limestone weighing as much as a truck. It required them to carve those blocks into precise, standardized shapes, and to decorate them with detailed art. It required them to transport those blocks and raise them upright, and to do it again and again, across multiple enclosures, over generations. Estimates suggest that moving and raising a single one of the largest pillars would have taken hundreds of people working together. That means this was not the work of a single family or a small wandering band. It required a large, coordinated, motivated workforce. Dozens or hundreds of people, organized toward a shared goal, fed and housed for as long as the work took. And remember, they did all of this with tools of flint and stone. No metal chisels, no iron, no wheels to move the blocks, no pulleys, no cranes, no draft animals strong enough to haul them. Just human hands, stone tools, rope, timber, and an idea powerful enough to make people move mountains of rock. Which raises the question that has haunted this place since the day Schmidt understood what it was. Who were these people? And how could hunter-gatherers possibly have built this? Chapter 4. Built before civilization. To appreciate the mystery, we have to correct a picture most of us carry in our heads, the picture of the caveman. We tend to imagine Stone Age hunter-gatherers as ragged, isolated, struggling day to day just to survive, incapable of anything grand. Göbekli Tepe destroys that image completely. The people who built this were anatomically identical to us. The same brains, the same hands, the same capacity for planning, art, and belief. What they lacked was not intelligence. What they lacked was the toolkit we think of as civilization. Agriculture, metal, writing, the wheel. And yet, without any of it, they conceived and executed one of the most ambitious construction projects the world had ever seen. The evidence tells us clearly who they were. In the layers of the site, archaeologists find the bones of wild animals: gazelle, wild boar, aurochs, wild birds, hunted, not herded. They find the remains of wild cereals, gathered, not farmed. There are no bones of domesticated sheep or cattle in the earliest layers, no grinding of cultivated grain. Every scrap of evidence says the same thing. These were hunters and gatherers, living off the wild abundance of a landscape that was, at the time, far greener and richer than the dry hills we see today. Their tools tell the same story. Across the site, archaeologists find thousands of pieces of worked flint, blades, scrapers, the chipped stone points of the age, but not a single scrap of metal, because metalworking lay thousands of years in the future. Every one of those giant pillars was quarried and carved by stone striking stone. In the bedrock nearby, you can still see an unfinished pillar lying where it was being cut, nearly 7 meters long, abandoned mid-birth. A frozen snapshot of the sheer, staggering labor this demanded. And the food that fueled that labor came entirely from the wild. Herds of gazelle moving through the valleys, wild boar, ducks and cranes, and the seeds of wild grasses gathered by hand. Among them the wild ancestor of wheat that grew on the slopes of a nearby volcanic mountain called Karahan. So how did people without farms feed a workforce large enough to build this? This is where one of the most fascinating clues emerges. Scattered through the site are the remains of enormous feasts, great quantities of animal bone, and huge stone vessels, some capable of holding well over 100 liters. Scientists have even found chemical traces in some of these vessels consistent with fermented grain. In other words, there is a real possibility that some of the earliest evidence for brewing, for something like beer, comes from this hill. Picture it. Hundreds of people drawn from across a wide region, gathering at this sacred hill. They hunt, they gather, they feast, they perhaps drink, and together they haul and carve and raise these giant stones. The building of the temple was not just labor. It may have been the greatest social event of their world. A reason for scattered bands of hunter-gatherers to come together, to cooperate, to become, for a time, something larger than themselves. And that idea, that a shared sacred project could pull people together on a scale never seen before, leads us to the most revolutionary claim about Göbekli Tepe. A claim that flips the entire origin story of civilization on its head. It was Klaus Schmidt's great thesis, and it is still argued over today. Chapter 5. The Temple That Built a World. Here is the old story once more in a single line. First came farming, and farming eventually made temples possible. Klaus Schmidt looked at Göbekli Tepe and proposed the exact opposite. First came the temple, and the temple made farming necessary. His reasoning was this: if hunter-gatherers were gathering in large numbers at this sacred place, again and again over many years, to build and to worship and to feast, then they faced a very practical problem. How do you feed hundreds of people, in one place for weeks or months at a time, when you live by hunting and gathering? Wild game and wild plants can only stretch so far. The answer, Schmidt suggested, might have been agriculture. The pressure to feed the great gatherings at places like Göbekli Tepe may have pushed people to find more reliable food, to start protecting, tending, and eventually domesticating the wild cereals that grew nearby. In this view, it was not full bellies that gave rise to religion. It was religion, the need to gather and to build, that gave rise to farming. And this is not just a nice story. The geography supports it in a stunning way. Göbekli Tepe sits within a region that genetic studies have identified as one of the very birthplaces of agriculture. The wild ancestor of einkorn wheat, one of the first domesticated grains on Earth, has been traced to a mountain range within sight of this hill. The transformation of the human species from wanderers into farmers began, quite literally, in this landscape, at almost exactly this time. The genetic trail is remarkably precise. When scientists traced the DNA of domesticated einkorn wheat back to its wild source, the closest living relatives turned out to grow on the slopes of that same mountain, Karahan, within sight of these very hills. In other words, the grain that would go on to feed the first villages, the first cities, and eventually the first empires was first tamed almost exactly here, at almost exactly the moment Göbekli Tepe was rising. Whether the temple truly drove people to farm, or whether temple and farm simply grew up together, hand in hand, the birth of agriculture and the birth of monumental religion happened in the same small corner of the world, in the same narrow window of time. That is very hard to write off as coincidence. Something extraordinary was happening to the human mind right here. So the picture that emerges is breathtaking. In this one region, in this one narrow window of time, humanity crossed the single most important threshold in its history, the shift from hunting and gathering to settling and farming, the change that would eventually lead to cities, kingdoms, writing, and everything we are. And standing at the heart of that transformation is a temple, built by hunter-gatherers, to gods whose names we will never know. Now, in fairness, this remains a debated interpretation. Not every archaeologist agrees that Göbekli Tepe was a temple with no one living there. More recent work at the site has found evidence that complicates the simple mountain sanctuary idea. Signs of possible dwellings, and cisterns cut into the rock to collect water, hinting that people may have lived here, at least part of the year, more than Schmidt first believed. The line between temple and settlement may be blurrier than we thought. But even the most cautious version of the story leaves the central shock intact. Whether it was purely a temple or also a home, Göbekli Tepe proves that complex belief, monumental architecture, and large-scale cooperation existed among hunter-gatherers before agriculture, not after it. The flowers, it turns out, bloomed before anyone planted the seed. And then, after more than 1,000 years of use, the people did the last thing anyone would expect. Chapter 6. Why did they bury it? For over a millennium, generation after generation came to this hill. They built new enclosures. Curiously, the later ones tend to be smaller and less ambitious than the earliest ones. As if over time, something was being lost, or changing, or fading. The oldest circles are the grandest. The magic, whatever it was, seems to have been strongest at the beginning. And then, around 8000 BCE, the story reaches its strangest chapter of all. The people of Göbekli Tepe took their sacred site, the enclosures, the great carved pillars, the animal guardians, and they buried it. Deliberately. They filled the enclosures with rubble, with soil, with broken stone and the debris of their feasts, packing it in until the giant pillars were entombed and the circles disappeared beneath an artificial hill. This is, in fact, why the site survived so perfectly, and why we can date it so precisely. That blanket of fill sealed the enclosures away from the outside world for 12,000 years, protecting the carvings and locking in the ancient debris that radiocarbon dating would one day read like a clock. In a sense, the people who buried Göbekli Tepe are the reason we can still see it at all. But why would anyone do this? Why take something you and your ancestors spent lifetimes building, something clearly sacred, and deliberately entomb it in the earth? We do not know. And here it's worth being honest, even the deliberate burial itself is now debated. Some researchers argue the fill built up more gradually, through erosion and the dumping of refuse over long periods, rather than in one great intentional act. The truth may lie somewhere in between. But the classic interpretation, and the one many still hold, is that this was a purposeful closing, a ritual act of ending. If it was deliberate, the theories are haunting. Perhaps when an enclosure had served its purpose, when a leader died or an era ended, It was ritually killed and put to rest, the way some cultures decommission a sacred object by breaking or burying it. Perhaps the burial was itself an act of worship, a way of returning the stones and the gods to the earth. Perhaps as the world changed around them and farming villages began to spread, the old ways of the great gatherings lost their meaning, and the people closed the door on an age that was ending. There is one more clue about what these people cared about most, and it is a chilling one. Among the bones recovered from Göbekli Tepe, researchers identified fragments of human skulls that had been deliberately altered after death, carved with long, straight grooves cut into the bone, and in one case drilled with a hole, as if to hang or display the skull on a cord. Published in 2017, the finding pointed to what archaeologists call a skull cult, the ritual treatment, decoration, and display of the heads of the dead. Now remember the headless figure beneath the vulture stone, and the carved head with its serpent-like neck watching over the shrine at Karahan Tepe. Again and again at these sites, we meet the same obsession. With heads, with the dead, with the fragile boundary between the living and whatever lies beyond it. Whatever religion was born on this hill, it stared, without flinching, straight into death. Whatever the reason, the effect was profound. The hill went silent. The gatherings stopped, and Potbelly Hill became just another rise in the landscape, a mound of earth hiding a lost world, waiting 11,000 years for a shovel to strike stone. For a long time it was tempting to think of Göbekli Tepe as a one-off, a single miraculous sight, an isolated wonder. But in the last few years, the ground around it has begun to speak. And what it's saying is even more astonishing. Göbekli Tepe was not alone. Chapter 7. The Stone Hills Awaken. Just 37 kilometers from Göbekli Tepe stands another hill, called Karahan Tepe, and since excavations there began in 2019, under the archaeologist Nick Carroll, Karahan Tepe has begun to reveal a site every bit as strange and as old as its famous neighbor, dating back some 11,400 years. What has come out of the ground there is extraordinary. In one chamber cut directly into the bedrock, archaeologists uncovered a row of 11 great stone pillars shaped like phalluses, standing around the edge of the room. And set into the wall, watching over them, is a human head carved from the living rock, a bearded face, with what appears to be a serpent-like neck emerging from the stone. It is eerie, deliberate, and unlike anything from any later age. Then in 2023, came a discovery that made headlines around the world. At Karahan Tepe, the team unearthed a statue of a man, around 2.5 meters tall, fixed in a seated position on a stone bench, his hands clasped over his groin. It has been called one of the most impressive examples of prehistoric art ever found, and it may be the oldest life-size statue of a human being ever discovered on Earth. Nearby, from the same wider culture, comes another candidate for that title, the so-called Urfa man, a life-size human figure with eyes of black obsidian, staring out across 11,000 years. And here is the crucial point. Göbekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe are not two isolated wonders. They are part of a much larger picture. Archaeologists have identified a whole cluster of these ancient sites scattered across the region, at least a dozen related hills, and they have given the network a name, Taş Tepeler, which means the Stone Hills, an entire landscape of monumental sites, built by the same remarkable hunter-gatherer culture, at the very dawn of the settled world. At one of these sites called Sayberk, archaeologists recently uncovered something perhaps even rarer than a statue, a story. Carved along a stone bench is a scene, a man clutching his phallus, flanked by snarling leopards on one side, and on the other a figure facing a great charging bull, its horns lowered to strike. Researchers have called it the earliest known narrative scene in all of human art. Not merely a picture of an animal, but a moment, an event, characters caught in relationship with one another. The very beginnings of storytelling, chiseled into rock 11,000 years ago. Site after site across the Stone Hills tells the same larger tale. This was not a single miracle on a single hill. It was a whole culture, spread across a region, sharing the same gods, the same symbols, and the same astonishing way of building thousands of years before the first true city would ever rise. This changes everything about how we understand Göbekli Tepe. It was not a freak accident, a single genius flash in the dark. It was the crown jewel of a whole civilization of builders. A people who across an entire region were raising stone monuments, carving the oldest statues on Earth, and expressing beliefs we are only beginning to glimpse, thousands of years before the first city was ever founded. We can even start to see the outlines of what they believed. The recurring images, the dangerous animals, the human figures, the emphasis on male fertility seen in the statues and pillars, the carved heads and severed skulls found at related sites, hint at a complex spiritual world, concerned with life and death, ancestors and animals, fertility and power. It is a religion without a single word of scripture, spoken to us only in stone. But for all these new discoveries, the deepest questions remain exactly where Klaus Schmidt left them. Chapter 8. The question that remains. So let us gather what we truly know. We know that around 11,500 years ago, in the hills of southern Turkey, hunter-gatherers built monumental stone temples. We know they did it before farming, before pottery, before metal, before writing, before the wheel. We know they carved giant human figures and fierce animals into multi-ton pillars, using only stone tools. We know they gathered in great numbers and feasted, and cooperated on a scale no one thought possible for people of their kind. We know that, after more than 1,000 years, their sacred hill fell silent and was covered over. And we now know that Göbekli Tepe was only one of many such sites across an entire lost landscape. And after all of that, the questions that matter most are still unanswered. We do not know what they believed. We do not know the names of their gods, the meaning of the animals, or the stories those carvings were meant to tell. We do not know exactly why they built on such a colossal scale, or precisely how a pre-agricultural society organized the labor to do it. We do not fully understand why the grandest enclosures came first, and the later ones grew smaller and simpler, as if a fire were slowly dying. And we do not know for certain why they buried it all. But perhaps the most profound thing Göbekli Tepe tells us is not about them. It is about us, and about how little we really knew. For a century, we told ourselves a confident story about how civilization began, and we built our textbooks around it. Then a German archaeologist followed a hunch to a hill everyone else had dismissed, and a single swing of a spade proved the story wrong. It should make us humble. Because if we could be so wrong about something this fundamental, about the very origin of the settled world, then how much of the rest of the human story is still lying out there, buried under some ordinary-looking hill, waiting to overturn everything we think we know? And the hills of southern Turkey are far from finished with us. Less than a tenth of Göbekli Tepe has been excavated. Karahan Tepe has only just begun to open. A dozen more of the stone hills lie barely touched. Each digging season, new pillars, new statues, new carved faces rise out of the earth, and each one adjusts, complicates, or deepens the story. The people who raised these stones have been silent for 11,500 years. But slowly, patiently, stone by stone, they are beginning to speak again, and we are only just learning how to listen. The people of Göbekli Tepe raised their gods in stone at the very dawn of our kind's great adventure. They stood at the doorway between two worlds, the endless age of the wanderer, and the coming age of the farmer, the city, and the king. And they left us a message we still cannot fully read, carved into limestone by hands that had never seen a wheel or written a word. We are only beginning to listen. Across those silent hills in Turkey, the oldest temples on Earth are still giving up their secrets, one careful excavation at a time. And every answer they offer seems to raise two more questions in its place. If this journey into humanity's deepest past moved you, take a moment to like this video. It genuinely helps more people discover these forgotten stories. Tell me in the comments what you think they were building and why they buried it. And subscribe to the Ancient Hour, because every week we uncover another secret the ancient world tried to keep. The hills are still full of them, and they are still waiting.